Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our From Petersburg to Appomattox Symposium and Tour, which was conducted in September of 1996. You've already seen my introduction, so I won't go into a great deal of detail at this point, other than to introduce you to the speakers that we had in this program. And it looks like all of these speeches came up and are in pretty good order. So what I would like to introduce you to is first off the operations in and around City Point. When Grant makes a decision to cross the James River, he's hopeful that he'll be able to make a quick move inland and perhaps cut Lee off from his supplies and force him to evacuate the city, or at least fight him on open ground. The failure of the first Union offensive in June of 1864 causes Grant to come in and cross the river and begin to set up and begin to expand his operations to the west. To do this, he's going to have to bring all the supplies in. He's going to have to get them to the soldiers that are going to be in camp as Grant extends his lines further and cuts more and more of Lee's lines of communications. And so the effort that he makes is to set up a military railroad system that once the supplies come into City Point, where he sets up his headquarters, he's going to set up various stations in which the supplies can be offloaded, put on the railroad, and then carried to the soldiers in the trenches so they don't have to come looking. It's a very sophisticated operation, something that's overlooked a lot. And so I thought that this was something we really ought to present. And fortunate for us, Jimmy Blankenship, one of the National Park Service historians, had made this the subject of his academic studies. And because he was stationed working at Grant's headquarters over at City Point, he had a lot of time to uncover all of this. And so he had a well put together analysis of the impact of the military railroads on Grant and his success with this. So I think you're really going to enjoy this oft overlooked logistical issue and the presentation, the care that Jimmy puts to it, because it will in fact enlighten you as to how it was possible for Grant to sustain himself and ultimately succeed in a 10-month operation against Robert E. Lee across static lines. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Jimmy Blankenship on Grant's military railroads.
So out of 8 hours a day, I get maybe 1 hour to write. All right, the military railroad, most of the information I found was in the National Archives, and I really didn't find a whole lot before I went there. I was kind of getting a little discouraged. By the time I did get up there, the very first day, I knew I had enough to write a book. There was so much information up there. The military railroad was actually pretty much organized by Herman Hawk, but he's out of the picture by September '63. Him and Halleck got into it. Halleck got rid of him basically, and then Danielson McCallum took over. So McCallum was actually in charge from September '63 to the end of the war. McCallum was a colonel initially, and then eventually a brigadier general. Now the military railroad was organized pretty much into two departments: the transportation department and the construction department. Now at City Point, by the end of June, there were about 833 members of the military railroad. Only 40 were in the transportation department. These would be engineers, brakemen, the people who actually operated trains. The other 800 and some odd people would have been in the construction corps, carpenters, people who did the actual work. So the bulk of the information I had was on the military railroad construction corps. The book I'm writing is strictly on the railroad during the siege of Petersburg. So I'm not going to really deal with anything much before that. The railroad people were over at White House Landing June 12th. They got orders to leave and to report to City Point. but they couldn't get past Grant's pontoon bridge that was built over there on the James River. Grant wanted to make sure the bulk of his army was on the south side of the river before they would allow any shipping to go through. So the railroad folks had to sit there for 3 days in the river until the army had crossed, until they had opened up the bridge, and then they were able to arrive at City Point by around 1 a.m. on June 18th. This is the third day of fighting, so they didn't get to City Point until the third day of fighting was almost over. Well, had about started. The chief engineer in charge of the construction corps was a man by the name of Charles L. McAlpin, and I was very fortunate to find about 800, 900 of his letters in the National Archives. And these are just the letters dealing with Petersburg, and he really wrote quite a bit of information. I also found a journal of daily events up in the National Archives, and this was a journal kept at railroad headquarters at City Point, and they wrote down everything they did every single day. I also, beginning in November '64, found the daily work reports of the various construction gangs, and again, they would write down what each construction gang had done that particular day. So it was just a tremendous amount of detailed information. I had so much information that I could actually write a day-to-day account of what the railroad folks did for the entire 292-day siege, and then on into Appomattox, and then the aftermath up until about the end of May when the railroad was finally disbanded from out of Petersburg. So it's a lot of detail in this thing. I thought about maybe writing by topics at first, but I would have to be doing June to April probably 25 times throughout the book, and that would not work. So I decided to go ahead and write this out as a day-to-day type project. The railroad folks did not just work on one project, didn't go to another one, didn't go to another one. They were working on several projects day to day, and so I felt the best way for the reader to understand what they were going through was for me to write this as a day-to-day account. So like June 15th or July 15th, they'd be working on 7 or 8 projects, so that's the way I'm going to have to deal with this. McAlpin did manage to get to City Point on June 16th. He took a steamer which was on the west side of the pontoon bridge and came up to City Point. Just to get an idea of what he was getting into, he found that the channel along the waterfront, the channel was along the waterfront, right up against the shoreline, a perfect place for a port. The waterfront he had to work with was about 1,800 feet, not really a lot, and it was only about 30 to 60 feet wide. So a very small amount of area to put all these wharfs and docks up to equip the Union Army. Now just to give you an idea of the scale of this supply base, just the animals and horses in the Union Army, 65,000, would consume 600 tons of fodder every single day. All that had to be transported out to these animals. A large amount went by the railroad, about a minimum 1,400 tons per day. But if your unit or your animals are not near the railroad, then they would use supply wagons to take the supplies out to you. As many as 1,500 supply wagons were used daily from City Point going out to the front, not counting the railroad. McAlpin also found out that the wharfs that had been located at City Point had all been burned off to the water line by the Confederates when they left. He also found that the City Point Railroad had been destroyed for a distance of about 3 or 4 miles leading out of City Point. Another reason Grant did go to City Point, there was a railroad already there, the City Point Railroad. It went from the river right into Petersburg, a perfect avenue of supply for the Union Army. So the first orders they received was basically to rebuild that railroad and to start building some wharfs and docks. Now, June 19th, McAlpin did examine this railroad. He found that the rails were missing, tires were rotten, but there were no large bridges to deal with, at least on this 5-mile stretch. They couldn't go the whole 7 miles because the other 2 miles would be behind the Confederate lines. He did order about 20,000 railroad ties to be sent up from Norfolk, so all this material that they would bring into City Point was prefab. It was already cut. All they had to do was put it together once it arrived at City Point, so a very modern type quartermaster system. We get many quartermaster groups at City Point from Fort Lee, and they are amazed at how similar it still is today with the modern U.S. Army compared to the way it was in those days. The first locomotive which arrived at City Point would be June 20th, and it was called the General Dix. Now, in unloading the General Dix, a stringer which measured 12 by 14 by 26 feet broke, and it nearly capsized the engine. It almost fell over into the river, and what saved it was basically that the wheels stuck to the rails, and that's what kept it from falling over into the river. And in about half an hour, it was landed safely on the wharf. So this would have been an ominous beginning for the railroad folks to have their first engine fall off the barge and land into the river. Now the way they moved these rail fleets around was interesting. They would take what they call track barges, and that's just a barge with railroad tracks laid on top of them. They would drive the trains up onto these barges, and then the barges would be towed behind steamers, and that's how they would get the rolling stock and the locomotives down to Petersburg. Everything would come by water. They did not go overland at all because it was too risky. So the rivers were much safer. They would either go down the Atlantic coastline, the Chesapeake Bay, and then into the James River and up to City Point. Very safe. The Union Navy was very strong out there. As long as the rivers were wide, it was very easy for the Union to control the areas. On June 21st, work actually started on repairing the City Point Railroad. They also had to change the gauge. That's another problem they had. Usually when they captured Confederate railroads, the gauges were very rarely what they already had. The Union used 4-foot, 8.5-inch gauges, but Confederate railroads were various. Most of them around Petersburg, though, were 5-foot gauges. So even when they captured the Confederate railroad, they would still have to move one of the rails. Now, the man in charge of all military railroads in Virginia for the Union was Major Erasmus L. Wentz, and he was in charge up until around November. His headquarters was located in Alexandria. So McAlpin is always sending telegraphic messages up to Alexandria requesting laborers, requesting material to be sent down to City Point. By June 25th, City Point had taken on the appearance of a busy port. The wharfs were beginning to be built. The very first wharf they worked on naturally would be the railroad wharf to get these locomotives and rolling stock unloaded off these barges. The wharf was built out over the mud flats up to the channel. The barges would just come in, and the railroad on the railroad barge, on the railroad wharf, they laid a railroad that went out to the end of the wharf so that they could line up that barge with that railroad. They could start that engine up. It's already loaded. They brought them down loaded with materials, and then it could just take on off and be at the front in about 30 minutes' time. The supply system would work like this, but y'all probably heard most of this yesterday, but the regimental quartermaster would send in requisitions on the 20th of every month, up to brigade quartermaster, up to division quartermaster, up to corps quartermaster, and then to the army quartermaster, and then to Rufus Ingalls, the chief quartermaster for the armies operating against Richmond, who was located in the house that I work at City Point. The material would be sent up to Washington, it would be collected, and then sent back down that chain of command, and that's how the Union Army would get its supplies. By June 26th, they needed some locomotives at City Point. The railroad was beginning to look like it was shaping up quite a bit. But boat captains did not like to haul locomotives because of the weight. One locomotive would weigh as much as 50,000 pounds. And if you're in some choppy seas out in the bay and you're kind of rocking back and forth, you don't want to have all that weight kind of on one side of your vessel. So some boat captains simply refused to carry them, or at least tried not to carry locomotives around with them. By June 28th, about 5 miles of the railroad had been repaired. They had completed about 1,000 lineal feet of wharfage over at City Point, covering 50,000 square feet. They had also started to build stations along the route. Generally speaking, about every 5 miles, well actually about every 3 or 4 miles, they would have stations built. Now don't get the idea that it's a fancy place. A station, generally speaking, is just a platform built along the side of the railroad. The height would be the same as the boxcars or the cars, so they just unload right on that platform. So that's what a station is. Some stations did have telegraph offices. Some of them did have water tanks for the locomotives. But generally speaking, a station is just a loading platform, and that's about it. I don't know. I only have a few photographs of one station, sea level station. I've never come across a photograph of any other station. I do have a sketch of Birney Station, but other than that, they didn't take photographs of these places as far as I've been able to find. Now, the first train that left City Point was on June 29th, and it was the General Dix, and the first cargo it carried was basically fodder for the animals. The first day, 58 carloads were hauled. The next day, 71 carloads were hauled. So this is the type of detailed information that I was able to find on this. This book is going to be very detailed, but I like that myself. Now, as of June 30th, they had a total of 873 men working at City Point, or working along the line. They had gangs. The average number in each gang was about 30 people. The largest gang was actually a black gang, Hartley's gang, and numbered 81 men, while the smallest gang would be a pile driving gang of about 8 or 10 men. Now the pile drivers with steam-driven engines and they would pound these pilings down into those mud flats, just like you see them working on bridges on the highways today. And the only difference between a gas pile driver and a steam pile driver is one uses wood or coal, the other one doesn't. So the situation is still the same as far as driving these things. By July 1st, they started to build warehouses. Now these warehouses were gigantic. Some of them measured 50 by 300 feet. The first 3 warehouses they built required 240,000 board measured feet of timber. So we're talking about lots and lots of wood being shipped down to City Point. By July 2nd, the trains were running on a regular basis with passengers and supplies. They had a total of 82 cars on the line by this point in time. So in less than 3 weeks' time, the railroad was completed to City Point, from City Point to the outskirts of Petersburg, and the railroad was operating at full scale. Now, railroad folks were also very well-paid people. General Grant, as a lieutenant general, made $240 a month. McAlpin, as a chief engineer, made $200 a month. Agents at the stations made $100 a month. Laborers made anywhere from $1.75 to $2.40 a day. A union private, as of July '64, only made $16 a month. So that railroad carpenter is making more money in 1 week than that army man is in a month, and the railroad carpenter very rarely is going to risk his life. July 7th, the famous mortar arrived at City Point, the 13-inch Seacoast mortar known as the Dictator. It was mounted, it would eventually be mounted on a railroad car, and believe it or not, this was actually General Butler's idea. It's one of the few ideas that Butler had that actually worked. And the railroad wharf actually had to be strengthened where they were going to land this thing at because of the weight. It weighed over 17,000 pounds. When they did unload it, they would have to use a rope 1 1/4 inches thick, and the gun had to be lifted and landed on the wharf. It was completed in only 17 minutes' time. So that's amazing that they could lift 17,000 pounds and land it in that short a period of time without any kind of mechanical means. They used a gin, and I didn't know the kind of gin I knew was something that you drank, and I had to look this one up. This was a device used for lifting heavy objects, basically. And so that's how they did it. It was placed on the bed, and when it was fired, it was on a railroad car initially. Because of the recoil, the 17,000-pound mortar and the 2.5-ton railroad car all recoiled about 12 feet along the railroad track. It fired a 200-pound shell. It could throw it 2.5 miles away. So that will give you an idea. This was definitely the largest piece of ordnance ever used at Petersburg. Now, it was only used from the early July until the end of September. Initially, it was used to try to silence the Chesterfield batteries, Confederate batteries on the north side of the Appomattox River, who were basically enfilading the Union right flank. So the Dictator was pretty much used to try to silence those batteries. It didn't really silence them, but it was also used psychological means. It did shell Petersburg, too. Now, by July 7th, there were 5 locomotives operating on the line, and it was fully operational for a distance of about 5 miles. Work continued on the wharfs and buildings. The railroad office was completed, and they continued on. They would start to build more wharfs at City Point. After the railroad wharf was built, they would start on the quartermaster wharf, commissary wharf. The other wharf I couldn't think of yesterday, there were 8, was the coal wharf. Most of these locomotives would burn coal. So they had 2 quartermaster wharfs, commissary wharf, forage wharf, the U.S. mail wharf, the coal wharf, the ordnance wharf, and I forgot another one again. But anyway, it's 8 of them. And so all of that would be built over a period of about, most of these wharfs were completed in about 2 months' time. They would eventually cover 350,000 square feet in area. By the end of the siege, the wharfs alone were valued at $193,000, which in today's currency would probably be anywhere from $15 to $20 million. And needless to say, the Park Service is not going to reconstruct any of this. Okay, McCallum came down in mid-July, about July 14th, to see how the railroad folks were doing. He went to City Point, he paid Grant a visit, and when McCallum asked Grant how the railroad department work had been going on since the campaign had opened, Grant said, quote, as smooth as a greased wheel. And I like that. That's what I'm hoping I can name this book, As Smooth as a Greased Wheel, but publishers usually pick the name, so I probably won't have much say-so on that. Also, Captain Andrew J. Russell showed up at City Point with his photograph apparatus, so he was also there taking photos. And we have about, so far, over 240 photographs at City Point, and a lot of them have railroad stuff in it. So I have a great photographic collection of the railroad activity at City Point and some other various places. Now, the railroad people, okay, one more quote here. This is about the dictator. One of the times they fired it, it damaged the railroad car. Well, the quartermasters tried to fix it, but they couldn't repair it, so who better to fix a railroad car than the railroad folks, and so they repaired it. McAlpin wrote this: "We have repaired the mortar car, and yesterday they fired it every half hour with splendid success, so that the Rebs have abandoned Fort Clifton. Some of our men saw the explosion which sent the parapets, timbers, and men 40 feet into the air. We intend to pay them 13-inch compliments to all in succession. They can throw beyond Petersburg from Pickerington Station," and that would have been right outside the east side of Petersburg. So the dictator could throw some rounds a pretty good distance away. Now, very often the railroad department would run the quartermaster department out of timber, and it's kind of, it just gives you an idea of how hard working these guys were, that they could actually run the Army folks out of supplies. So sometimes railroad projects were stalled because they had to wait for more timber to come down from Alexandria. Now, by July 22nd, Grant ordered a survey to be made to connect the City Point Railroad with the Weldon Railroad. If you have your park brochure there, you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. This would be in a southwest direction from City Point Railroad down to the Weldon Railroad. Grant still had to capture the Weldon Railroad first before this could be done, but he did order a survey to be done. Now, during the month of July, they had a total of 6 locomotives working on this line. The railroad eventually was 7 miles long by the end of July. The last depot was Pickerington Station, 5.5 miles from City Point. The last mile and a half of the railroad beyond Pickerington Station is used to position the dictator. They had it on a curve in the railroad, so that's how they could aim it in various